Alien princess was meant to be a lab rat, but the human guard stole her away at midnight. Beneath the frozen tides of the North Atlantic, where the world forgot to look, a military-grade elevator hummed down through layers of blackened steel and reinforced oceanic stone, lowering another silent observer into the belly of humanity's most secret prison, the Cavendish Research Facility. Within these pressure-sealed walls where light flickered sterile and footsteps echoed like memories trying to escape, a girl lay strapped to a surgical gurney inside Cell 9, her limbs bound by magnetic cuffs, her skin too pale for someone who once bathed beneath the suns of Lisar Prime. They called her Asset LX9 now, stripping her of her name, her birthright, and her voice in the span of a single war crime. But her true name was Kiora, crown daughter of the Lisari Empire, firstborn of a civilization that had fallen in silence when Earth's covert operations struck with speed and treachery. Her capture hadn't been televised, hadn't made the feeds or war briefings, they hadn't even told their own soldiers. It was cleaner this way. She was classified genetically critical, her blood a key to technologies the Earth Alliance didn't fully understand, her psychic resistance labeled as anomalous, her emotional detachment marked as both a threat and an opportunity. For weeks now, she had endured without a scream, needles probing, machines scanning, disembodied voices asking questions in languages she refused to dignify with answers. But through it all, through every sedation cycle and simulated interrogation, she remained outwardly unbroken, eyes open and unreadable, the only flicker of rebellion left to a girl stripped of everything except her will not to weep, and it was those eyes that disturbed him. The man in the gray uniform who sat behind glass and watched her every night, a silent guardian of the cell who never touched her, never questioned her, never addressed her, not until the 7th night. His name was Elias Ward, 46, a former Marine turned facility security operative after losing his family in what the reports still called collateral atmospheric damage, a lie wrapped in bureaucratic silk. He'd been through wars, seen orbital colonies burn and comrades vaporized in pressurized suits, but nothing unnerved him like the way this girl watched him, not with fear, not with contempt, but with a calm curiosity that made him feel like he was the specimen, not her. Every night she lay there, hooked to drips, skin marred by antiseptic wounds, yet still regal somehow, her silence louder than the doctor's voices. He told himself she was just another assignment, another protocol to follow, but when she blinked slowly, deliberately, as if recording him in some alien memory system, he found himself lingering too long on his patrols, past Cell 9, lingering just long enough to see if she would open her eyes again. It was on the 7th night during the dead stretch between 2nd and 3rd shifts that she spoke, not in defiance or despair, but with unsettling precision. "You lost someone," she said through the glass, her voice fragile but sure, and Elias froze mid-step, his hand on the scanner, breath caught. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't given her anything to go on, but her words were a scalpel through 20 years of silence, and for the first time since his daughter's screams faded from a faulty escape pod, he let someone see the ache behind his eyes. He didn't reply, couldn't, but he returned the next night, and the next, and the next. He started to notice things, the way she turned away when the medical team entered, the way she tensed when they reattached the neural cuffs, the way she mouthed something in her own language just before they sedated her again. One night he bypassed protocol, disabling the audio jammer in her cell just long enough to hear her whispering, not prayers, not curses, but names. Names of family, names of siblings, names now lost to the stars. He began leaving small kindnesses, extra, warmth in the cell's atmospheric controls, a blanket slightly heavier than allowed, a light dimmer than regulation during sleep hours. None of it was ever acknowledged aloud, but she knew. Her eyes no longer met his as if he were a stranger. They regarded him with quiet expectation. One night, she asked his name. Just that. A soft, almost childlike question. "Yours?" He hesitated, standing beyond the blast-sealed window, his hand hovering over the voice intercom. But something in him surrendered. "Elias," he said quietly, ashamed of how alien his own name felt in that moment. She nodded once. The next night she spoke his name aloud, and it sounded less like a label and more like a ceremony. Elyaz, as though tasting the syllables for the first time. From that night onward, something shifted. She asked about Earth's oceans, about wind, about dogs. He lied sometimes, he had to, but never about the big things. She told him of her home in return, of trees that glowed when touched, of birds that sang in colors, of a world now likely reduced to ash. She never asked to be freed, never begged. She simply began to remind him with every quiet exchange that she was still a person, and when he read the memo, flagged in red on his terminal during a routine shift, the one marked Midnight Termination Order Subject LX9, he felt his throat close like a coffin lid. They hadn't told her yet. They probably wouldn't. There would be a sedation protocol, a full-body dissection, DNA fracturing, and disposal. They'd harvest her mind if they could before it dissolved. Midnight. Just like that. He left his post early, heart pounding, heat rising behind his eyes. Every rational part of his brain told him to walk away, to file his resignation in the morning and pretend she'd never existed. But when he stood outside Cell 9 again, when he saw her resting with hands unclenched for the first time, eyes fluttering in something like peace, he couldn't pretend anymore. He tapped the override key, opened the door, stepped inside for the first time unfiltered. She looked up, alarmed, trying to sit up despite the restraints. "Are we dying tonight?" she asked softly, not with panic, but with weary acceptance. And he knelt beside her, unlocking each cuff with trembling fingers, whispering the only truth he had left. "No. We're running." They moved like shadows stitched to the bones of the underground, slipping through dim-lit hallways where every flickering panel and low hum felt like a scream waiting to be triggered, the sterile silence of Cavendish facility cracking at the edges as Elias Ward guided the fragile, half-conscious alien girl down maintenance corridors meant for cleaning drones, not fugitives. Princess Kiora, still weak from weeks of psychic suppression, had barely the strength to walk. Her steps faltered, her breathing labored, but she never complained. Not even when the cold bit into her bare feet, or when the motion detectors overhead flickered red, before Elias jammed them with an outdated override code he'd memorized back. When the facility still trusted him, he was breaking protocol, betraying his oath, severing whatever thin thread of loyalty he had left to the Alliance. But all he could see, all he could hear, was her voice in his memory, asking if they were dying. And he knew now, with clarity that burned like guilt, that he could not be part of the machine that consumed children, no matter which galaxy they came from. The emergency stairwells were rarely monitored. No one wanted to climb 200 feet when hoverlifts worked fine, so he dragged her through them, one arm bracing her waist, the other holding his service weapon just in case. She didn't ask questions. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she'd known this moment would come the day. She looked into his eyes and saw something that hadn't been fully extinguished. The deeper they descended, the more the facility shifted from clinical to industrial. The ceilings lower, the walls rusting in places where oceanic pressure crept through hairline cracks. The scent of coolant and salt water thick in the air. Kiora paused only once, when they passed a decommissioned observation room, a glass wall shattered, bloodstains faded but still present, and she looked at it like she remembered the screams. Elias had to tug her away gently, whispering, "We don't have time." She nodded, silent again, and followed. Down level 19, through a disused laundry shaft, across a narrow bridge that led to the maintenance crawl spaces, a nightmare of tight metal, buzzing pipes, and darkness, and finally, after what felt like hours pressed into mere minutes, they emerged in a forgotten cargo bay used once for aquatic drone deployment and now only for storage, its surveillance looped nightly by Elias himself. It was here he'd stashed the stolen suit, a data pad with forged clearance codes, and a thermal jacket she could barely fit into. He wrapped it around her carefully, trying not to notice how thin her wrists had become, how her skin seemed to shimmer faintly under the overhead lights with the bioluminescence of a species slowly starving. We have 20 minutes before. The shift rotation notices I'm gone, he said, mostly to himself. But she nodded anyway, clutching the edge of the jacket like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. Where will we go? She asked, her voice dry, raspy but steady. He didn't lie. Out, that's all I can promise. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the idea of out was freedom in itself to someone who hadn't seen the stars in weeks. The submersible launch hangar was 2 floors below, and Elias's stolen access code still worked, though it flashed yellow longer than expected. They stepped into the elevator and prayed. As the doors slid shut, he caught her reflection. In the mirrored panel, eyes like liquid silver, lips chapped but calm, head tilted like she was still calculating odds. "Why are you helping me?" she asked then, and the question hit harder than a bullet. He didn't answer until they were descending, the floor trembling slightly beneath their feet. "Because my daughter would have been your age," he said, finally, quietly, as though the words had waited years to be spoken. Kiora said nothing, but she reached out, just once, and rested her hand over his. It was a strange gesture, unfamiliar in human custom, yet somehow deeply personal. The submersible bay was quiet, too quiet, and Elias knew they were running out of borrowed time. He activated the emergency override, disengaging one of the stealth pods, a 2-seater barely rated for deep ocean currents but fast and small enough to avoid sonar nets. She climbed in first, movements slow but purposeful, while he loaded rations and a medkit he'd stolen 3 days ago under the pretense of inventory review. The vessel sealed around them with a hiss, and for the first time he saw her flinch. Claustrophobia, maybe, or the memory of other chambers that closed like this, but never opened again. He reached for her hand, not as a soldier, not as a rescuer, but as Elias, the man who had once held his own child through storms and silence. The launch countdown began, and the pod dropped, violently, into the freezing black of the Atlantic, pressure groaning against the hull, and Kiora gasped, pressing, both hands to the glass as the ocean swallowed them. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and Elias couldn't help but look. Outside, deep-sea creatures pulsed with light, clouds of bioluminescence curling through the dark like ghosts of things never meant to be seen by surface dwellers. The pod shook, stabilizers kicking in as they passed beneath the facilities, sensor ring, and entered open sea. For now they were safe. Not free, but safe. Elias adjusted the course manually, angling north toward a GPS dead zone near Iceland, where an old resistance safe house still existed in theory if the world hadn't swallowed it like so many other secrets. Kiora leaned her head against the wall, exhausted, and in the faint hum of the vessel he could hear her whisper something in her own language, a lullaby maybe, or a prayer. He didn't ask. Some things didn't need translation. When the pod surfaced hours later, breaking through icy waters under moonlight, Elias exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Snow fell in slow spirals around them, and mountains loomed like sentinels in the distance. They dragged the pod into a rocky inlet, covering it with snow and tarp, then hiked slowly toward a cluster of geothermal vents where the safe house should have been. He kept her close, one arm always ready to catch her if she fell, but she never did. Not once. And when they found the entrance, half buried in ice and moss, it opened to Elias's palm print, as if it had waited for him all this time. Inside, warmth, silence, and a light that didn't flicker. Kiora stepped in slowly, eyes wide, and turned to him as though unsure what to say. "It's not a palace," he said, shrugging off his coat, "but it's ours for now." She didn't answer. She simply walked to the center of the room, sat on the floor, and for the first time since he met her, since she arrived bloody and silent in Cell 9, she wept. No screams, no sobs, just silent tears trailing down alien cheeks onto a floor, not meant for royalty. Elias didn't speak. He just sat beside her, letting the moment breathe. They were fugitives now, hunted by the most powerful governments on Earth, but somehow in that quiet space between breaths and snowfall, they were more free than either had ever been before. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm neither of them expected nor fully trusted, like exiles pretending at peace in a war that had not yet stopped chasing them. And in that quiet refuge beneath Iceland's frost-bitten soil, Elias Ward and the alien girl once known as Princess Kiora learned the fragile weight of survival not defined by alarms or sedation schedules, but by the ache of healing and the awkward intimacy of silence filled by breath instead of fear. The geothermal bunker, once a rebel communications hub now forgotten by every map, offered little in comfort but everything in freedom. A cracked solar array barely clinging to function, a filtered spring beneath the concrete floor that provided drinkable water, a generator that growled like a wounded bear every time it started up, and warmth. Real warmth. Not the artificial temperature settings of a containment chamber, but heat that touched skin and melted through bones until even Kiora, with her near-psychic composure, began to shed the layers of her trauma in tiny, involuntary gestures. A sigh while sleeping, fingers no longer clenched in dreams, and eyes that blinked not with caution, but wonder. Elias tried not to watch her too much, but it was impossible not to. She moved like someone unfamiliar with the concept of choice, flinching at loud noises, hesitating before touching food, waiting for permission before resting too long in one spot, like her captors might still appear through the walls and punish her for having needs. It took him 3 days to realize she hadn't asked to use the bed, not once. She simply curled into corners, wrapped herself in blankets and lay awake with her back against the stone, eyes open, staring at shadows that no longer threatened her. "You know it's yours, right?" he said on the 4th day, standing at the edge of the room, arms crossed as she sat cross-legged on the floor examining a spoon like it was an alien artifact. She looked up slowly, puzzled. "What is?" "The bed," he said, nodding toward the cot in the corner, still untouched. "It's not just for decoration." Her lips parted, confused, then pressed together again. "I didn't want to assume." Elias's throat tightened, and he nodded slowly. That night she used the bed, but only after he had turned off the light and pretended to sleep. Trust, it seemed, was a gradual thing. He taught her how to cook, not because she needed it, necessarily. She learned fast, and her physiology could adapt to a terrifying range of food, but because the act of sharing something normal gave them both an excuse not to talk about what came next. They played music once, from his ancient, cracked tablet, a scratchy piano track that echoed softly through the room, and she listened with her eyes closed, fingers drumming against her knees in rhythm. "Do your people have music?" he asked. She nodded. "We used to." It was the kind of answer that left too much unsaid, so he didn't push. In return, she began to speak more of her home, not in sweeping declarations, but in tiny, painful fragments. Of her sister who loved to swim in the bio-rivers beneath their twin moons. Of her mother, whose voice could still sing through memory like a lullaby across galaxies. Of the day the sky turned red, and she realized they were losing. Elias didn't try to match her stories. What did he have, really? A house that no longer stood. A daughter who never made it out. A war that taught him how to shoot before he learned how to grieve. But one evening, as they sat beside the generator and shared instant coffee he'd bartered from a long-dead supply crate, he told her about Lila, his daughter, about how she loved to draw maps of places she'd never been, how she insisted the stars whispered if you listened hard enough. "She would have liked you," he said softly, staring at the wall. Kiora didn't respond right away, but later that night, as the wind howled outside the bunker like a creature kept at bay by steel and spite, she left a folded drawing near his gear, a pencil sketch of a star map, dotted with symbols he didn't recognize. "That's where I think we are," she said when he looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. "In case something happens to me." The weight of those words settled into the air like a fog that didn't lift. And then came the transmission. On the 7th night, while checking the outer relay, an antenna half frozen into a mountainside, Elias intercepted a scrambled signal. It wasn't local. It wasn't even encrypted in Earth military code. It was Lissari, a faint, repeating beacon, distorted by distance and damage, but unmistakable. Kiora heard it once and nearly collapsed. "That's a distress cadence," she said, clutching the speaker. "It's from a survivor." A survivor. The word lit something in her he hadn't seen before. Hope so fierce it almost hurt to witness. She wanted to go. Find them. Whoever they were. But Elias hesitated. The transmission was triangulating toward Greenland. Far, dangerous, crawling with patrols and scan drones. And worse, Cavendish would have realized by now that their asset LX-9 had vanished. They'd be tracking anomalies, off-grid thermal spikes, anything that might give them a lead. "We'll die if we go," he warned. But she didn't blink. "We die if we stay." And he knew she was right. They packed that night, silently. Less talking now. Every moment heavy with anticipation. He gave her his old combat jacket. It drowned her frame, but she wore it proudly. "It smells like smoke," she said. "That's because it's been through hell," he replied. The journey north took 2 days by sled and broken hoverbike, the latter salvaged from a hidden supply. Cache Elias hadn't touched in over a decade. They slept in caves, shielded their tracks, and kept moving through snow that sliced the skin like razors. On the 3rd night, they found the wreck. Buried beneath an avalanche scar, the remains of a Lissari scout vessel still flickered with dying power, half melted into the ice like a ghost trapped mid-scream. Kiora dropped to her knees beside it, hands trembling. There was one survivor, a boy, barely 15 by human measure, gaunt, frostbitten, and delirious with infection. Kiora wept when she touched his face. "My cousin," she said brokenly. "They thought I was the last." Kiora wept when she touched his face. "My cousin," she said brokenly. "They thought I was the last." Elias helped extract the boy, carrying him like he once carried Lila when she scraped her knees and insisted she was fine. They brought him back to the bunker, treated the fever, reset broken bones with makeshift splints. For 2 days, the boy hovered between life and death. And during those 2 days, Kiora didn't sleep. She sat at his side, speaking in her language, her voice cracked and low, singing lullabies like threads stitching a soul back together. When he finally opened his eyes, he whispered one word, "Chari," and Kiora sobbed into his shoulder. "We're not extinct," she said to Elias later, her voice thick with disbelief. "We're not extinct." For the first time she smiled, a real, unguarded smile. And Elias, for the first time in years, felt what hope tasted like when it wasn't a lie. The snow had begun to fall heavier by the time the message came, not from a transmitter, not from a scout vessel or rebel relay, but from the sky itself, a low mechanical growl that split the clouds above the bunker like a warning carved in thunder, and Elias Ward knew before he even looked through the scope that they had been found. The ship was matte black, no lights, no insignia, but unmistakably human in its predatory silence, a hunter that had come not to bargain or question, but to reclaim what it believed was property stolen in the night. Kiora stood beside him, her cousin still weak but resting inside, and for a long time they both just stared at the ship hovering in the sky like a god with no face. "We don't have time to run," he said, voice flat. She nodded, lips pressed thin, but her shoulders no longer trembled like they had when they first met. "Then we make them listen." The plan was reckless, stitched together with desperation and the stubborn refusal to be caged again. Elias rigged the outer vents with flares, old military trick, and broadcasted a fake surrender code from a buried signal booster, one that made the approaching squad believe they'd caught him in remorse, broken, ready to trade information for leniency. But the moment their boots hit the ice, Elias triggered the charges, not to kill, but to scatter, blind, disorient. In the confusion, Kiora stepped forward. Not as a prisoner, not as a lab specimen, but as a sovereign, her voice amplified by the speaker system inside the old rebel tower, her words cutting through static and snow like fire. "You call me Asset LX9, she said. "But I am Princess Kiora of Lisar. My people still live. My blood is not yours to catalog." Elias watched from cover, rifle steady, but he didn't fire. This wasn't his moment. It was hers. The soldiers hesitated. One raised a weapon. Kiora didn't flinch. "You are not liberators. You are thieves. But I offer you this. Step down, and you'll be remembered as those who listened, not those who destroyed." And then, to everyone's astonishment, the boy, her cousin, bruised and frail, staggered from the entrance and stood beside her, eyes alight with something ancient and defiant. He raised his hand. It shimmered. Bioluminescence spiraled through the air, a visual language unmistakably alien, a signal flare, a call home. Somewhere, orbiting far beyond Earth's atmosphere, another ship had heard it, and it was coming. The first soldier dropped his weapon. The second followed. The commander, helmet off, stared at Kiora not with fear but awe. "You're not what they said," he muttered. "No," she replied. "I never was." The standoff collapsed, not in violence, but in silence. And in that moment, history shifted. They didn't all agree. Some of the soldiers retreated in defiance, calling for reinforcements, threatening consequences. But by the time the diplomatic cruiser arrived, silver, massive, adorned with Lisari insignia, and flanked by independent peace envoys, it was too late to pretend she hadn't spoken the truth. Kiora didn't run when the ship landed. She walked forward, shoulders straight, her cousin at her side, Elias just behind. The Lisari delegation emerged first. Survivors, warriors, children grown in hiding, a people long believed extinguished now returned in strength. When they saw her, they fell to one knee. The humans didn't understand the words they spoke, but the meaning was clear. She was royalty. She was alive. And she had endured. Elias felt it then, the fracture in himself, the one he'd carried since the day Lila died, begin to ease. He didn't belong on that ship. His story was bound to Earth, to its failures and the small redemption he'd found in betrayal. But Kiora turned to him anyway, just before she stepped aboard, and pressed something into his hand, a shard of her ship's crystal core, still glowing faintly. "So you never forget," she said, "that we were real, that you mattered." He tried to speak but couldn't. She kissed his forehead, a Lisari gesture of gratitude. Then she was gone, rising into the sky not as a fugitive, but as a queen, returning from exile. In the months that followed, the world changed slowly, then all at once. The footage Elias leaked, the medical records, the experiments, the protocols, sparked outrage, trials, resignations. Cavendish facility was shut. Town-human Lisari negotiations began in earnest, and while the road ahead remained fraught with mistrust, fear, and the ghosts of what had been done, there was a new possibility on the horizon, a shared one. Elias never returned to active duty. He bought a farm in a quiet valley, far from cities, and politics where the stars were visible every night and the silence didn't feel like guilt anymore. He kept the crystal on his mantle. Some nights when the sky shimmered just right, he imagined he could still hear her singing through the dark, not as a prisoner, not as a weapon, but as the girl who had once begged for water and instead been given a name, and with it, a future no longer stolen.